Pick and rolls. You've probably heard them mentioned a million times, maybe even been told to run them. But do you really know what they are, how to perform them correctly, or what their purpose is? For a rather simple play, pick and rolls have a fairly complex implementation in our sport, leaving them somehow both over and underused. But they remain a valuable tool in an offensive playbook, and proper implementation can go a long way in making your offense tick. So let's get into them. Pick and rolls have their foundation in basketball, where they are a play used to create mismatches and numbers advantages on the offensive side of the ball. It is for these exact qualities that the play has made its way into Quidditch. Let's first look at some applications of the play in basketball. In the first play, the player setting the pick is looking to change the defensive matchups of the opposing team. He screens the small, agile defensive player covering the ball handler, leaving a larger, less agile defender to switch onto him. The ball handler uses this opportunity to drive right to the hoop and score. In this next application, the defender tries to get around the opposing screen. He does so successfully and can now defend against a drive, but the spacing still allows a shot to be taken and made. In this final application, the player setting the screen is able to finally roll towards the basket and create offense themselves. The most important thing to note here is that as he sets this screen, he turns his body in a way that the player who should be switching onto him cannot possibly stay on the correct side of him. By spinning out in this fashion, he is now a full step ahead of the player who would eventually be defending him and will eventually get hit with the pass. Quidditch picks, however, are not the exact same as basketball picks. In basketball, a player's feet have to be set fully before they take the contact from the defending player. This limits mobility in setting that screen. But the Quidditch rulebook allows, thanks to Rule 612b4, a player's feet do not need to be set in order for the play to be legal, allowing much more latitude for how a screen can be set in Quidditch. Let's look at that in action. In this play, Harry Greenhouse, pictured here on the right side of the screen, is going to set a pick for Jake Archibald on Callum Malling, the Australian defender. Australia is in a zone, so this isn't going to be a full pick and roll, which usually attacks a man defense, but he's just simply trying to open up space for Archibald to take a shot. When he comes up to Malling, he's going to come from the far side and set a screen originally there, but Archibald's preferred side to get into the lane and shoot is actually going to be on the near side right over here. So you're going to see Greenhouse, given the latitude by that rule, continue to move around his screen until he successfully forces the defender to not be able to get through him. See how he actually moves his body all the way around the defender and basically even wraps him. Now wrapping is past the bounds of legal, but sometimes some hand checking you're going to be able to get away with in a screen in Quidditch. A lot of Quidditch players, even the top ones, still set their screens more like basketball screens, and so they don't always actualize the full value of them. In this play, Casey Irwin, right here, is going to come over and set a screen on Brian Mulcahy, the defender, here. She's going to set like a basketball screen where she sets her feet, and because of that, as you're about to see, Mulcahy is able to go under the screen, as we saw on some of the plays from the basketball. This does enough to affect Brian Mulcahy's path to the ball, allowing Garza to take a shot that he eventually makes. So it was a successful screen in that regard, but she could have entangled herself up with Mulcahy more to make it even easier for Garza to get to the far hoop and score. So now that we've talked about some of the basics that make up the play, what are the aspects of a good pick and roll? So the first most important thing is setting your body properly when you set a screen. As we'll show in the later videos, a lot of people think being perfectly horizontal to the defender is the best thing you can do because you're kind of squaring up your body to their side. But in fact, that allows for the defender to go under the screen many times, as we just saw Mulcahy do on the last play. So what you want to be doing is blocking both the path of the defender to the ball carrier immediately and also the path to recovery. What I usually teach players to do when setting a screen is to set themselves somewhat diagonal to the player they're setting the screen on, so that their foot closer to the hoops is actually slightly behind that player. So now that the defender can't go directly towards the defender, but they also don't have a path around you because your body has kind of fully engulfed them. And you can even use a little bit of movement at that point, like we said, to make sure you keep them held back. The second thing is how to go into your roll. So the key to here is to rotate into your roll by pivoting on the foot that's closer to the hoops. So let's say your entire body is facing the defender that you just set the screen on. If you are on the side of the defender where your left foot is behind them and closest to the hoops, you want to keep that foot in place and swing your entire body around the outside and until the point where your entire body now is behind that defender. At this point, they can't close into you. As long as you start cutting, you're always going to beat them towards the hoops, and we'll show that as well. At that point, you can even use a little bit of a body check to kind of throw that defender's momentum even further from the hoops and give you an extra step towards the hoop. And finally, when you make that cut, make sure you and the ball carrier aren't running down the same path towards the hoops. The two of you need to be wide enough that the defender's confusion leaves somebody open so that either the driver who originally had the ball can score or so that they can pass to you. So let's draw out what the play should look like. In this case, the red circles are the offensive players and the blue circles are the defensive players. As you can see, I have this red player setting the screen slightly behind this blue player so the blue player doesn't have a route to get around them to cut off where this player is going. If they can't get them here, then they're not going to be able to get them ever again, and this defender absolutely has to help with the play. The key for this player is they want to tuck in so that they're cutting just kind of right along the outside of the player setting the screen for them, so that there's no room for the defender to kind of get through in between. Once they've held that screen, like I said, they're going to pivot around that inside foot so that their entire body is basically on this side of the player. And then, as we also said, they need to cut outside to create enough space so that no matter what this defender does, they can't cover both players. If this cut was made here, this defender would kind of be covering both at the same time. This opens up a drive. If this player doesn't cover, it opens up a pass here, or it even just opens up a shot as soon as this player's come around their screen. All right, now we're going to look at a couple of strong pick and rolls run by a few different teams to kind of get an example of what they should look like. In this case, the ball's being held here by Craig Garrison, and he's going to come around here and get a screen. And basically what's happening is that, I believe this is Brian Mulcahy. He's a very, very strong point defender for Boston, and you want to isolate a strong point defender out of the play, and the way they're going to do this is with this pick and roll. So see, just like I said, this screen is set slightly behind his body so that now he can't fight through it down here as he was able to in the last play we watched. His only option is to beat it here, which is not going to happen because the defender has the ability to go left and right to block him out, and he's also already got 1 foot towards the hoops compared to the defender. Boston's going to play this correctly. They have to make the switch, but again, it's isolating a better defensive matchup. Now, did you see that body check right there? He body checked him back so that now when he starts his cut, he's going to have almost a full step on him because all of his momentum just got shoved to the left foot. Meanwhile, they've created a new matchup over here, and you can see the way he's going to roll perfectly out into this cutting lane. Meanwhile, the ball handler is taking advantage of that better matchup to drive themselves. This defender is now in no man's land, right? They're neither able to pick up the driver or the player making the cut. And though this ends up being a shot that goes through the hoop, the point is that I think it might have even intended to be a pass, and the passing option was wide open. So really, every part of that play executed absolutely perfect by San Antonio. The perfect screen, the wide roll, the perfectly timed cut, and they were able to isolate a good defensive matchup and score off of it. All right, we're going to watch another pick and roll here. Very similar situation. Again, like we see, here's Tyler Trudeau setting the screen. His entire body almost completely is behind the defender. He's not perfectly horizontal to the defender because once Greenhouse here tries to make this drive, he wants to cut off any options. Now you can see that Lone Star is pretty prepared for this switch. So it doesn't look like Greenhouse is going to be able to score himself here as we saw in the last play because this is a very strong defensive team. Trudeau, very much like we saw in the last clip, basically puts his force into this screen. He's keeping Marshall out of the play and pushing him. Again, momentum fully forced back. Now he's got almost a full 2 steps on Marshall. Even though this is being picked up perfectly, Trudeau's now going to cut out to the middle. Easy pass for Greenhouse. This defender did all they could. This defender did all they could. None of it mattered because Trudeau was open off that pick and roll motion for the goal. So why aren't pick and rolls more prominent? Well, unfortunately, our sport also has beaters. And in these situations we've been looking at where we're trying to create these driving lanes and these passing cutting lanes towards the hoops, there's often a beater sitting right in the middle of that, which makes it impossible. So there has to be a real timing element to when you implement pick and rolls. From the same game where we just saw Trudeau sit that very nice pick and roll, you can see Fox sets a perfectly apt screen. I'd maybe argue it should have been a little bit further back, but it doesn't really matter because there's defenders sitting back, so they're never going to be able to run this play off of it anyway. That doesn't mean Fox is wrong for setting the screen. It just means that every pick and roll isn't always going to work, and every pick and roll doesn't need to necessarily become something. Greenhouse is fine to just look this pick and roll off and start again. What really needs to happen in any offensive set is that you need to constantly be making motions. And whether that's cuts towards the hoop or setting pick and rolls, you always have to be doing something. Players shouldn't be sitting flat-footed on the offensive end. And if a team is willing to commit to this constant series of actions, then pick and rolls are definitely something you should be putting into your repertoire. But if you're not, or if you think that just because you ran it once in a possession you're good to go, you're not going to be effective with them, and you're going to get discouraged and stop using them. So what are some common misconceptions of pick and rolls? First one, as we were just talking about, is that you only need to run one pick and roll in an offensive set. Again, this is just one idea. It's one attempt to create some movement in your offense to either get a beater out of position, get a chaser out of position, get an opening for a shot. If it doesn't work, just like anything else you try to do on the offensive end in Quidditch, you can always pull it back, set reset, and try something new. Next thing is that pick and rolls are an offensive system. That I can just install pick and rolls into my offense and I'm good to go. That's just not how it works. Offensive systems in Quidditch are more complex than that. There are a series of actions, cuts, positioning, etc. that all comes together to give you a way to score goals in the half court. Pick and rolls are a mechanism in offensive sets and honestly should be at least partially a mechanism in every offensive set, especially if our sport continues to move to two-arm tackling, where winning one-on-one battles against defenders becomes harder and harder, but they're not in and of themselves an offensive system, and you need to think more on a macro level than just installing pick and rolls. Next one is that I always need to run a playoff pick and roll. This is more of an issue I saw especially in earlier years, where you would set your pick and roll at the beginning of the play, you'd go off of it, and you either score or you don't score and you turn it over. There's nothing else to it. If it doesn't look good, just pull it out and try again. If your beaters lose the exchange, reset. If the defenders make a perfect switch, just back off and run something new. You don't need to run a play every single time. And the final one is I don't need to involve my beaters in preparing pick and rolls. And like we just showed, it's very much a timing thing when it comes to pick and rolls. You really want to be creating, if not a no bludger situation, a situation where every beater is at least having their attention split, right? In that San Antonio-Boston clip we watched earlier, the beater doesn't actually get beat out of the play. They have a bludger the whole time, but they're concentrating on an opposing beater, which makes it impossible for them to fully focus on the pick and roll and eventually give up the goal. The beaters need to know that you're making this action and it might distract the defensive beaters so they can make a play for bludger control, or that they need to create the no bludger situation to allow this pick and roll to work. So beaters are very much an important part of the pick and roll process. And finally, I wanted to touch on one last thing because it was brought up in one of my earlier videos where I mentioned that pick and rolls are basically something that you should always be including in your offensive sets in snitch on pitch with no bludger situations. And why is that? Well, like we just talked about, the hardest thing about running a pick and roll is the fact that there's beaters in the way. So if there's no beaters in the way, your pick and rolls should work like gangbusters every single time. And that's because we're basically playing basketball at that point, right? There's no beaters, it's just 4-on-4, but even better, one of those four is almost always guarding the hoop, so you have a numbers advantage to begin with, and that creates almost impossible problems for the defense if you run it correctly. Let's look at a couple from the Boston Knight Riders in Game 2 of the MLQ Championship Finals, which we've also reviewed if you want to go back and check out that video. So here, Jake Archibald's driving. Grace Dastu is going to set a screen. Now, Grace Dastu was the unmarked player on the Boston offense because the keeper was staying at the hoops, which means that just by setting the screen, there's nobody here to cover Archibald. Usually, the person covering the screener would be stepping to Archibald, but that person doesn't exist. So now, as Archibald starts driving, Casey Irwin, who is covering Teddy Costa, is instead going to start stepping over to Archibald, and now Costa's open. So Archibald is just going to zip a pass over there, and now the defense is all out of sorts, right? Costa's going to catch the ball, drive, and score. Let's look at another one. In this play, it's once again Dastu setting a screen for Archibald to the left side, this time on Irwin. Irwin reads the screen coming and tries to back off further and further and further, but again, she's not getting any help because Dastu wasn't covered by anybody to begin with. So just by switching the angle, Archibald's able to get a cut to the left side. Irwin really does everything she can, and even with that shove from Dastu, is able to get to that side of the ball, but she's never able to get a proper angle on Archibald because of this play. Archibald then is able to make a cut back. At this point, Irwin is overcommitted, and he's able to square himself and make a shot. But if he had wanted to, if we go back one more time, he could have also easily just passed it across to Dastu, who's cutting very smoothly right into the lane as she's supposed to off of that pick. So the reason that pick and roll should be everywhere in Snitch on Pitch is because there's no bludgers ever, and with no bludgers ever, pick and roll creates such problematic numbers situations for the defense that it's almost hard not to score. So what did we learn today? First, we learned that Quidditch screens give more latitude than basketball screens because you can move your feet even after you've set your pick. So that means you can make it really, really difficult for the defender to get around you. You can move side to side. You can cut off any angle you need to in order to keep that defender from getting to the ball carrier. We learned that pick and rolls are built to attack man defenses, but as we saw in that clip in the US against Australia, they sometimes can even create space against hybrid zones, where just giving Jake Archibald in that play enough space to shoot was enough to create a goal. We learned that pick and rolls need to be carefully timed with your beaters, because in order to use those driving lanes and those passing lanes, ideally you need to at least be distracting their beaters, if not taking them out of the play completely. And really, this play is a great chance to distract the beaters so your beaters can make attacks on them if you time everything perfectly. And finally, we learned that because there's no beaters in Snitch on Pitch play, pick and rolls become extremely potent and hard to stop because the numbers just don't add up for the defense, and it becomes very hard to stop goals as you're using these picks to create number advantage after number advantage. I hope this was a productive video for you. Thank you everybody so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. We'll be back with more Back to Basics in the future, and have a good one.